You've spent years doing what was expected of you, showing up, working hard, solving problems, carrying responsibilities without complaint. And somewhere along the way, that became your identity, the one who gets things done. But there's a quiet question beneath it all. Has it actually given you control? Because if you're over 40, you've likely started to notice something that doesn't feel right. No matter how consistent you are, no matter how much effort you put in, your progress feels limited. Not stuck, but capped. As if there's an invisible line you can't quite cross. At first, it's easy to ignore. You tell yourself it's normal, that stability is enough, that this is just how things work. But that feeling doesn't go away. It grows slowly, quietly, until you can no longer pretend it isn't there. And that feeling is not random. It's the result of how you've been trained to think about work, money, and progress since the very beginning. A mindset built for reliability, but not necessarily for control. You were taught to complete tasks, meet expectations, and follow systems created by others. And while that builds discipline, it also shapes how you see opportunities. You focus on execution, not direction, on effort, not leverage. There is nothing wrong with working hard. But if all your progress depends on how much time you give, then your growth will always have limits, because time is finite. And once it's gone, so is your ability to produce more. That's where the shift begins, not in what you do, but in how you think. Because a worker asks, what needs to be done today? An owner asks, what can I build that continues without me? And those two questions lead to completely different lives. Most people never make that shift, not because they're incapable, but because they've spent decades reinforcing one way of thinking. They've become efficient, reliable, and consistent, but always within someone else's structure. And at some point, you begin to feel it. That quiet realization that no matter how well you perform, you are still operating within limits that you didn't create, still trading time for progress, still depending on something outside of your control. That's the moment that matters, because you can either ignore it and continue the same pattern, or you can begin to question everything you've been taught about how progress actually works. Because thinking like an owner doesn't start with a business. It starts with awareness, a different way of looking at time, value, and effort, a way of seeing that goes beyond completing tasks and into creating outcomes. An owner doesn't just work harder, they think differently. They look for leverage, for systems, for ways to make their effort multiply instead of repeat. They stop asking how to do more and start asking how to make what they do count more. And once that shift begins, it's impossible to unsee. You start noticing how often your time is being exchanged directly for results, how your progress stops the moment you stop, and how that model, no matter how stable, cannot scale. But here's what changes everything. You don't have to start over. You don't have to abandon what you've built. You only have to begin thinking differently within it, to see opportunities where you once saw routine. Because ownership is not just about what you have, it's about how you approach everything. It's a mindset that transforms how you make decisions, how you invest your time, and how you define progress itself. And as that mindset grows, your behavior follows. You begin to move with more intention. You look for long-term value instead of short-term completion. You start building instead of just finishing. That's when things begin to shift. Slowly at first, then more clearly, you start to feel a different kind of control, not over everything, but over your direction. And that alone changes how you show up every day. So the real question is not whether you've worked hard enough, it's whether you've been thinking in a way that allows that effort to grow beyond your time. Because effort without leverage will always reach a ceiling. What you're about to hear will challenge the way you've approached work for years. It will ask you to step beyond the mindset that kept you stable and into one that gives you something far more powerful. And if you stay with it, you may begin to see that it's not too late to shift, not too late to think differently, not too late to move from simply working to building something that finally works for you. There is a form of identity that is built slowly, quietly, and without deliberate intention. It is not chosen in a single moment. It is formed through repetition, through expectation, and through the consistent fulfillment of responsibility. A man becomes known as reliable, capable, dependable. And over time, this recognition becomes the foundation of how he sees himself. If I were to begin again, I would examine this identity carefully. For while it appears strong, it may also contain a limitation that is not immediately visible. There is a pattern that begins early. A man is taught to complete what is given to him, to perform well, to meet expectation. He learns that effort produces reward, that consistency produces stability, and that reliability produces trust. These lessons are reinforced through years of repetition, and because they are reinforced, they are accepted. If I were beginning again, I would not reject these teachings. I would expand beyond them. For they build strength, but they do not necessarily create control. There is also the gradual shift from behavior to identity. A man does not simply perform tasks, he becomes one who performs them. He does not merely solve problems, he becomes one who solves them. And in this transformation, he begins to define himself by what he does, not by what he directs. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this distinction early. For what a man does repeatedly becomes what he believes himself to be. There is also the reward that reinforces this identity. A man who performs well is recognized. He is trusted. He is relied upon. Others come to him with responsibility. They depend upon his ability to execute. And in this, he gains position not through ownership, but through usefulness. This appears to be advancement, yet it contains a quiet limitation. If I were beginning again, I would not confuse usefulness with control. There is also the invisible ceiling that forms as this identity strengthens. A man's progress becomes tied to his ability to perform. The more he does, the more he is given. The more he is given, the more he must do. And in this cycle, his growth is directly connected to his effort. This is the structure of the worker. And within this structure, there is a limit. If I were beginning again, I would recognize that this limit is not imposed by ability, but by design. There are many who reach a certain point in life and begin to feel this ceiling. They are not failing, they are not stagnant. They are progressing, but within a confined range. Their effort increases, yet their advancement does not increase proportionately. And this creates a quiet question. one that is not always spoken but always felt. If I were beginning again, I would not ignore this question, for it is the beginning of awareness. There is also the realization that this ceiling is not visible at first. It appears only after years of repetition. A man believes that if he continues, something greater will emerge. Yet over time, he begins to see that his progress follows a pattern that does not expand beyond his effort. If I were beginning again, I would study this pattern closely. There is also the example of men who remained within this identity for many years. They became skilled, experienced, trusted. Yet their position remained dependent upon their continued presence. Their progress stopped when they stopped. This is not failure, it is limitation. If I were beginning again, I would not accept this limitation as permanent. There is also the contrast of men who step beyond this identity. A man such as Henry Ford did not remain defined by what he could personally produce. He shifted from doing to directing, from effort to structure, from repetition to multiplication, and in doing so, he removed the ceiling. If I were beginning again, I would understand this shift deeply. There is also the perception of others. A man who operates within the worker identity is respected. He is valued. He is seen as essential within a system. Yet he is rarely seen as one who controls the system itself. He is important, but not independent. If I were beginning again, I would not seek importance alone. I would seek control. There is also the emotional attachment to this identity. A man takes pride in his ability to perform. He values his reliability. He sees his consistency as strength. And in many ways, it is. Yet this attachment may prevent him from seeing beyond it. If I were beginning again, I would not lose this strength, but I would not allow it to define my limits. There is also the repetition that reinforces the ceiling. Each day the man performs. Each day he completes. Each day he fulfills expectation. And each day the pattern continues until it becomes unquestioned. This is the nature of conditioning. If I were beginning again, I would interrupt this conditioning through awareness. There is also the moment when clarity begins to form. A man sees that his effort is not the problem. His discipline is not the problem. His consistency is not the problem. The limitation lies in how his effort is structured. If I were beginning again, I would focus on structure, not effort alone. There is also the beginning of separation. A man begins to ask different questions, not what must I do, but what produces beyond what I do. Not how can I perform better, but how can this perform without me? These questions mark the shift. If I were beginning again, I would ask them often. There is also the transformation that follows this awareness. A man begins to see his role differently. He no longer sees himself only as one who executes. He begins to see himself as one who can direct, organize, and build. This change is not immediate. It is gradual. Yet it is powerful. If I were beginning again, I would allow this transformation to take place. There is also the removal of the invisible ceiling, not through working harder, but through thinking differently. A man who shifts his identity begins to act differently, and in acting differently, he begins to produce different results. The ceiling was never fixed. It was accepted. If I were beginning again, I would no longer accept it. There is also a final realization. A man who defines himself by what he does will always be limited by what he can do. But a man who defines himself by what he builds is no longer confined to his own effort, for what he builds can continue. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, do not allow your identity to be confined to execution. Expand it to creation. Let this be fixed firmly within. I am not only one who works, I am one who builds. I am one who directs. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as awakening. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, I would begin here. I would examine the identity I have accepted. I would recognize the ceiling it creates. And I would expand beyond it not by abandoning what I have built, but by redefining what it means until I am no longer limited by what I can personally produce, but guided by what I can create, direct, and allow to grow beyond me each day, without returning to the pattern that once confined me within the invisible boundaries of effort alone. Having recognized the identity of the worker and the ceiling it creates, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to understand that this limitation does not arise from the man alone, but from the structure within which he operates. For a man may act with discipline, consistency, and strength, yet remain confined if the structure he works within is designed to reward effort but not expansion. This structure is not hidden. It is accepted. If I were beginning again, I would examine it closely. There is a system that most men are introduced to early. It teaches that effort produces reward, that time given produces income, and that greater effort produces greater return. These teachings appear reasonable. They are reinforced through experience. And because they appear to work, they are rarely questioned. Yet they contain a condition. The reward increases, but only within limits. If I were beginning again, I would not reject this system. I would understand where it ends. There is also the appearance of fairness within this structure. A man believes that if he continues to perform, he will continue to advance, that his effort will always be matched by opportunity, that his consistency will lead to growth without restriction. Yet over time, he begins to notice something different. His effort increases, but his growth slows. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this moment as critical. There is also the nature of time within this structure. A man exchanges his time for result. He gives his hours, his energy, his attention, and in return he receives reward. This exchange becomes familiar, predictable, stable. Yet it contains a fixed boundary. Time cannot expand beyond itself. If I were beginning again, I would understand that anything tied directly to time must also be limited by it. There are many who reach a stage where they can no longer give more time. They have reached their capacity. They have refined their effort. They have become efficient. Yet despite this, their progress does not increase significantly. This is not failure. It is the limit of the structure. If I were beginning again, I would see this clearly. There is also the reinforcement of this structure through recognition. A man who performs well is rewarded. He is given more responsibility, more tasks, more expectation. And in this, he feels advancement. Yet what has increased is not his control, It is his obligation. If I were beginning again, I would distinguish between these two. There is also the unseen exchange that occurs. A man gives more of himself, his time, his energy, his attention, and in return he gains more within the same structure. Yet he does not move beyond it. He remains within its boundaries, and those boundaries are fixed. If I were beginning again, I would not remain unaware of this exchange. There is also the illusion of progress that this structure creates. A man may advance in position, in responsibility, in recognition, yet his condition remains tied to his continued presence. His progress does not continue without him. It depends upon him. And where there is dependence, there is limitation. If I were beginning again, I would question this dependence. There is also the example of men who reached high levels within this structure, yet remained confined by it. They earned more. They were recognized more. Yet their growth remained tied to their continued effort. When they stopped, their progress stopped. This is not a flaw in their ability. It is the nature of the system. If I were beginning again, I would not rely upon this system alone. There is also the contrast of men who understood structure differently. A man such as John D. Rockefeller did not rely upon effort alone. He studied systems. He organized movement. He directed capital and people in a way that produced beyond his own labor. He did not reject effort. He expanded beyond it. If I were beginning again, I would study this distinction carefully. There is also the realization that effort, when placed within the wrong structure, produces limited result no matter how great it is. A man may work harder, longer, and with greater discipline, yet if the structure does not allow expansion, his outcome remains confined. If I were beginning again, I would focus not only on effort, but on where effort is applied. There is also the emotional attachment to this system. A man believes in fairness. He believes that effort should be rewarded without limit. And when this does not occur, he may feel frustration, yet he may not understand why. This frustration is not without cause. It is the result of expectation meeting structure. If I were beginning again, I would adjust expectation through understanding. There is also the gradual awareness that must form. A man begins to see that his progress is not determined solely by how much he does, but by how what he does is structured. This realization is subtle, but once seen, it cannot be unseen. If I were beginning again, I would allow this awareness to guide me. There is also the perception of others. A man who performs well within this structure is respected. He is valued. He is seen as dependable. Yet he is not seen as one who expands beyond the system itself. He is part of it, not beyond it. If I were beginning again, I would move toward becoming more than a participant. There is also the beginning of a shift in thinking. A man moves from asking, "How can I do more?" to asking, "How can what I do produce more?" This question changes everything, for it introduces the possibility of expansion beyond effort. If I were beginning again, I would ask this question daily. There is also the realization that structure determines outcome more than effort alone. A man within a limited structure may produce limited results, regardless of ability. A man within an expanding structure may produce increasing results, even with modest effort. If I were beginning again, I would choose structure wisely. There is also the transformation that follows this understanding. A man begins to see opportunity differently. He no longer seeks only to perform, he seeks to position. He considers not only what he does, but what it becomes. This shift is not immediate, but it is decisive. If I were beginning again, I would follow it fully. There is also the removal of the belief that effort alone determines success. A man understands that effort is necessary, but not sufficient. That structure must allow for multiplication. That direction must extend beyond repetition. If I were beginning again, I would combine effort with structure. There is also a final realization. A man who operates only within a system that rewards effort will always be limited by the design of that system. But a man who understands structure can move beyond it, not by abandoning effort, but by placing it where it can grow. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, understand the structure you operate within, and do not allow your effort to remain confined by it. Let this be fixed firmly within. I do not rely on effort alone. I place my effort where it can expand. Repeat this, not as encouragement, but as awareness. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having recognized the identity of the worker, I would do this next. I would examine the structure that governs my effort. I would see where it limits me. And I would begin to shift not by abandoning what I have built, but by directing my effort differently until I am no longer confined by the exchange of time for result, but guided toward something that grows beyond my presence steadily, deliberately, and without the ceiling that once defined the limits of my progress. Having understood that structure determines the limits of effort, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to examine the nature of the work itself. For not all work produces the same result, even when equal effort is applied. Some work ends the moment it is finished. Other work continues long after the man has stopped. This distinction is rarely taught, yet it determines everything. If I were beginning again, I would not ask only what must be done. I would ask what remains after it is done. There is a habit formed through years of repetition. A man is given a task. He completes it. He moves to the next. And in this pattern, his focus becomes fixed upon completion. He measures success by finishing, by resolving, by closing. This creates efficiency, but it does not always create continuation. If I were beginning again, I would not measure by completion alone. There is also the nature of completed work. Once finished, it ends. It produces a result, but that result does not extend. It does not grow. It does not continue to produce without further effort. And so, the man must begin again. Each day, each task, each cycle repeats. If I were beginning again, I would recognize that repetition without extension leads to confinement. There is also another form of action, one that is less visible at first, yet far more powerful over time. This is work that creates outcome beyond its moment. It produces something that remains, something that continues, something that builds upon itself. This is not completion, it is construction. If I were beginning again, I would move toward this form of work. There is also the shift in thinking that must occur. A man must move from asking, "What must I finish today?" to asking, "What will this become tomorrow?" This question changes the nature of action. It introduces continuity. It removes the limitation of immediate result. If I were beginning again, I would ask this question before each effort. There is also the difference between effort that resolves and effort that multiplies. The first brings closure. The second creates continuation. One requires repetition. The other produces growth beyond repetition. And though both require action, only one builds beyond the man himself. If I were beginning again, I would choose multiplication over resolution. There is also the example of men who understood this principle clearly. Thomas Edison did not merely complete inventions, he created systems of production. His work did not end with a single result, it expanded into continued output, into structures that produced repeatedly. His effort did not conclude, it extended. If I were beginning again, I would study this approach deeply. There is also the misunderstanding that all work carries equal value. A man may exert himself fully, yet if his effort produces only immediate result, its effect is limited. Another may exert less visible effort, yet if his action creates continuation, its value increases over time. If I were beginning again, I would not measure effort by intensity alone, but by what it produces beyond itself. There is also the pattern that traps many men. They become highly efficient at completing tasks. They are precise, reliable, consistent. Yet their effort must always be repeated. And because it must be repeated, it never accumulates beyond a certain point. This creates a cycle, one that appears productive but remains confined. If I were beginning again, I would step outside this cycle. There is also the transformation that occurs when a man begins to think in terms of outcome rather than completion. He no longer sees tasks as endpoints. He sees them as beginnings. Each action is no longer isolated, it is connected to something greater. This creates continuity, and continuity creates growth. If I were beginning again, I would build this connection deliberately. There is also the effect upon time. A man who completes tasks uses time once. A man who creates outcome uses time repeatedly, for what he builds continues to produce. His effort extends beyond its original moment. This is the beginning of leverage. If I were beginning again, I would direct my time toward continuation. There is also the perception of others. A man who completes work is seen as dependable. A man who creates outcome is seen as visionary. The first is relied upon, the second is followed. And over time their positions separate. If I were beginning again, I would move toward becoming the latter. There is also the discipline required to think in this way. It is not immediate. It requires awareness. A man must pause not to delay but to consider. He must ask what his action will produce beyond its completion. This is not hesitation, it is direction. If I were beginning again, I would develop this discipline. There is also the compounding effect of outcome-based thinking. Each action contributes to the next. Each result builds upon the last. And over time, this creates growth that does not require equal increase in effort. If I were beginning again, I would allow this compounding to form. There is also the removal of the need to begin again each day. A man who works only to complete must restart constantly. A man who works to build continues from where he left. His progress is not reset, it is extended. If I were beginning again, I would build in this way. There is also the emergence of control. A man who creates outcome begins to move beyond dependence on constant effort. His results are no longer tied entirely to his presence. They begin to exist beyond him, and where something exists beyond the man, there is expansion. If I were beginning again, I would pursue this expansion. There is also the final realization. A man who spends his life completing work will always need to begin again. But a man who creates outcome builds something that continues, grows, and multiplies without requiring the same effort each time. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, do not seek to finish, seek to build what continues beyond your effort. Let this be fixed firmly within. I create what lasts. I build what grows. I act for outcome, not completion. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as direction. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having understood the limits of structure, I would do this next. I would change the nature of my work. I would no longer act only to complete, I would act to create. I would build outcomes that extend beyond my effort, and in doing so, I would move from a cycle of repetition into a process of expansion, where each action contributes not only to the present, but to a future that continues to grow, long after the work itself is done. Having understood the difference between completing work and creating outcome, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to recognize that repetition alone, though necessary in the beginning, cannot produce unlimited growth. For a man who repeats the same effort daily may become stronger, more efficient, more capable, yet he remains within the same cycle. And that cycle has a boundary. If I were beginning again, I would not seek to repeat indefinitely. I would seek to multiply. There is a condition that forms when a man relies solely upon repetition. Each day he begins again. He performs. He produces. And when the day ends, so does his progress. The next day requires the same effort, the same input, the same exchange. This creates consistency, but not expansion. If I were beginning again, I would examine where repetition ends and multiplication begins. There is also the difference between effort that resets and effort that carries forward. A man who repeats his work must always return to the starting point. His progress is dependent upon continuation of effort. Yet a man who multiplies his effort creates something that continues beyond his immediate action. This is the beginning of growth beyond limitation. If I were beginning again, I would direct my effort toward continuation. There is also the misunderstanding that more effort produces more result without limit. A man believes that if he works longer, harder, and with greater intensity, he will continue to grow. Yet there is a point at which effort can no longer increase meaningfully. The body tires, time ends, capacity is reached. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this limit early. There is also the introduction of a new